America's deal with the devil. In the late 1990s, archivists inside the Central Intelligence Agency began opening boxes that had not been touched in decades. The files were old, yellowed paper, fading ink, brittle staples, but the black bars across the pages were unmistakably modern. Names erased, paragraphs amputated, dates left intact, as if to taunt the reader. What emerged was not a single revelation, but a pattern. In 1998, the U.S. Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, a law intended to force full transparency about Nazi war criminals who had interacted with American intelligence after World War II. The promise was sweeping. Millions of pages would be reviewed, declassified, and released to the public. No more secrets, no more protection, no more silence. And yet, when historians finally gained access to the archives, they found something unsettling. The files were open, but not complete. Entire sections remained redacted. Some documents were released in fragments. Others appeared only after years of delay. In a few cases, records referenced reports that were never included, as if the archive itself were speaking in half sentences. The question was no longer whether the United States had worked with former Nazis after 1945. That fact was already undeniable. The question was simpler and far more disturbing. What was still being protected? To understand why these files matter, one must return to the moment they were created. In the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed with astonishing speed. Berlin fell in April. Adolf Hitler died on April 30th. By May 8th, Europe celebrated victory in Europe Day. Across the continent, mass graves were uncovered, concentration camps liberated, and survivors emerged from places the world had barely known existed. The word justice dominated headlines. The Nuremberg trials were announced as a reckoning without exceptions. But justice was not the only priority shaping the post-war world. Behind closed doors in Washington, London, and Paris, intelligence officials were already thinking ahead. The alliance with the Soviet Union was unraveling. Eastern Europe was slipping behind a new political curtain. The enemy was changing, and fast. For American intelligence, the defeat of Nazi Germany created a paradox. The regime had been criminal. Its methods had been monstrous. But its intelligence apparatus, particularly its knowledge of the Soviet Union, was unrivaled. No Western power possessed comparable insight into Soviet military deployments, political structures, or internal vulnerabilities. That knowledge did not vanish with the Reich. It lived in files, in networks, in people. By 1946, American intelligence officers had reached a conclusion they would never state publicly. Some former enemies were too useful to discard, not as citizens, not as heroes, but as assets. This was the beginning of a quiet bargain. Former Nazi intelligence officers, security specialists, and collaborators were evaluated not by what they had done, but by what they knew. Their pasts were cataloged, assessed, and, in some cases, set aside. The logic was brutally pragmatic. The Soviet Union, officials argued, would have no such moral hesitation. If the United States refused to act, Moscow would benefit. In this new conflict, restraint looked like weakness. By the late 1940s, American intelligence agencies were maintaining contact with individuals who had worn SS uniforms, enforced occupation policies, and participated in repression across Europe. These relationships were rarely celebrated and never advertised. They were buried in internal memoranda and coded correspondence, justified as temporary necessities in an unforgiving world. What made the situation especially volatile was the paper trail. Every recruitment created a file. Every payment generated a receipt. Every meeting left a record. Those records did not disappear. They accumulated. And from the beginning, officials understood the danger they posed. If revealed too early, They could undermine the moral authority the United States claimed in the post-war order. If revealed too late, they could expose decades of deception. The solution was not destruction, but control. Files were classified, access was restricted, releases were delayed. When pressure mounted, disclosures were partial. This system worked remarkably well. For decades, the American public knew almost nothing about the extent to which U.S. intelligence had relied on former Nazis. Occasional rumors surfaced, but they were dismissed as exaggerations or Cold War propaganda. The official narrative remained intact. The United States had defeated fascism and built a new world on democratic principles. The archives told a different story. When the first major batches of documents were released under the 1998 Disclosure Law, historians discovered that the most sensitive cases shared a common trait. They did not involve scientists or engineers whose work could be reframed as neutral. They involved intelligence relationships, informants, intermediaries, and operatives whose crimes were inseparable from their usefulness. These were not men brought to America to build rockets. They were men kept alive to provide information. In some cases, they were protected from prosecution. In others, investigations were quietly slowed, redirected, or abandoned. The justification was always the same: national security. The threat was always implied, never specified. And even now, decades after the Cold War's end, parts of the story remain hidden. Pages are missing. Names are blacked out. Dates lead to dead ends. The United States has acknowledged that it made compromises in the early Cold War. It has admitted that some of those compromises involved morally compromised individuals. What it has not fully explained is how far those compromises went, or who, exactly, they were meant to protect. This is not a story about conspiracy theories or secret cabals. It is a story about bureaucracy, fear, and the quiet decisions made when the world seemed on the brink of another catastrophe. It is a story preserved not in whispers, but in files. Files that still refuse to speak completely. The devil in this story does not wear a uniform. It lives in the redactions. In the summer of 1945, the war was officially over, but the intelligence war had barely begun. Across a shattered Europe, governments spoke publicly about reconstruction and justice, while behind closed doors a different priority took shape: information. The United States emerged from World War II with unprecedented power, but also with a profound strategic anxiety. Its former ally, the Soviet Union, was no longer a partner. It was becoming a rival, and possibly something worse. American intelligence officers understood one thing clearly: if the next conflict came, it would not be decided only by armies and bombs. It would be decided by knowledge about Soviet military strength, political intentions, internal divisions, and vulnerabilities. On that front, the United States was dangerously unprepared. Nazi Germany, for all its crimes, had spent years obsessively studying the Soviet Union. Its intelligence services had built networks, compiled reports, interrogated prisoners, and mapped territories far beyond what the Western Allies possessed. When the Reich collapsed, that knowledge did not evaporate. It survived in documents and, more importantly, in people. By May 1945, American counterintelligence units operating in Germany were already intercepting fragments of this legacy. They found abandoned files, half-burned reports, and intelligence officers desperately trying to trade information for protection. What alarmed U.S. planners was not merely the existence of these materials, but the speed with which the Soviet Union was moving to claim them. Red Army units advanced with their own intelligence detachments, seizing archives and detaining German personnel en masse. Entire intelligence cells vanished eastward. Reports sent to Washington warned that the Soviets were not just dismantling factories and laboratories. They were capturing minds. This created a brutal calculation. The defeat of Nazism had been framed as a moral crusade, but the emerging Cold War had no such clarity. American officials faced a dilemma they rarely articulated openly: whether to pursue justice without compromise or to sacrifice part of that justice in the name of survival. By late 1945, the answer was already forming. Inside the U.S. Army's intelligence apparatus, discussions shifted away from denazification toward exploitation. This was not yet a formal policy, but a practice that emerged organically from fear and urgency. Intelligence officers were instructed to identify individuals with anti-Soviet expertise, regardless of their political past. Files were annotated. Names were flagged. A new category entered the bureaucratic vocabulary: potential asset. Among the most significant figures to emerge from this chaos was Reinhard Gehlen, the former head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front. During the war, Gehlen had overseen vast analytical efforts focused on the Soviet Union. He knew troop movements, command structures, and political dynamics in a way few others did. Gehlen also understood his leverage. In May 1945, he surrendered to American forces in Bavaria, not as a defeated officer pleading for mercy, but as a man offering a bargain. He had preserved microfilmed copies of his intelligence archives and proposed an exchange: access to his network and knowledge in return for protection and continued relevance. American intelligence officers listened. Within months, Gehlen and several of his associates were quietly transported to the United States for debriefings. These meetings were not casual interrogations. They were negotiations. Gehlen made it clear that his cooperation depended on autonomy and security. He would help the Americans understand the Soviet Union, but only if his people were shielded from prosecution and allowed to rebuild their intelligence capabilities. The implications were staggering. Many members of Gehlen's organization had served the Nazi state faithfully. Some had been involved in occupation policies, interrogations, and repression across Eastern Europe. Their records were not clean, and American officials knew it. What changed the equation was timing. By early 1946, relations between Washington and Moscow had deteriorated sharply. Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in March of that year gave public voice to what intelligence agencies already feared. Europe was dividing into hostile blocs. The prospect of another war, this time nuclear, loomed increasingly large. In that atmosphere, Gehlen's offer became irresistible. American intelligence approved the creation of what became known as the Gehlen Organization, a covert network operating under U.S. supervision, but staffed largely by former German intelligence officers. Its mission was singular: gather information on the Soviet Union and its satellites. Its existence was secret, its legality ambiguous, and its moral cost carefully unexamined. The organization was financed and protected by the United States. Its members were housed, paid, and equipped. Investigations into their wartime activities were deferred or quietly shelved. The rationale was consistent and chillingly straightforward. Whatever these men had done, they now served a higher purpose. This was not an isolated decision. It set a precedent. At the same time, American intelligence agencies were reviewing hundreds of individual cases involving former Nazis who might be useful as informants, intermediaries, or operational contacts. These were not scientists or engineers whose work could be sanitized as neutral. They were men whose value lay precisely in their proximity to power and violence during the war. Files from this period reveal a striking pattern. Background summaries often acknowledged Nazi affiliations in vague terms, then pivoted immediately to assessments of utility. Phrases such as strong anti-communist orientation and valuable Eastern European contacts appeared repeatedly, while references to specific crimes were softened or omitted. The process was not always comfortable. Some officials expressed concern that employing former Nazis could backfire politically if exposed. Others worried about reliability, fearing double agents or compromised loyalties. These objections were noted and overridden. The Soviet Union, it was argued, posed an existential threat. In such a contest, moral hesitation was portrayed as strategic self-sabotage. By 1947, this logic had solidified into practice. The creation of the Central Intelligence Agency that year formalized many of these ad hoc arrangements. The CIA inherited networks, contacts, and files built during the chaotic immediate post-war period. It also inherited their contradictions. Within the CIA, former Nazi collaborators were classified as assets or sources. The language mattered. An asset was not judged by character, but by usefulness. Accountability belonged to the past. The present demanded results. Payments were authorized, meetings were arranged, protection was extended. In some cases, this protection went further than anticipated. When foreign governments or war crimes investigators showed interest in certain individuals, American intelligence intervened quietly. Requests were delayed. Information was withheld. Extradition stalled in bureaucratic limbo. The justification remained unchanged. Revealing these relationships, officials warned, could compromise intelligence operations and damage national security. The danger was always abstract, but the response was concrete. What made this system particularly resilient was its paper trail. Every interaction was documented, classified, and stored. Access was restricted. The more sensitive the relationship, the deeper it was buried. Over time, the files themselves became a liability, evidence not only of cooperation, but of conscious choices. This awareness shaped how records were handled from the start. Intelligence officers learned to write carefully, to avoid explicit references, to frame decisions in technical language. Crimes became allegations. Protection became operational necessity. Moral compromise was rendered bureaucratically invisible. Publicly, the United States presented itself as the architect of a new, rules-based world order. Privately, it was constructing a shadow architecture built on contingency and fear. The same government that championed the Nuremberg trials was simultaneously ensuring that some of the men who should have stood before them remained free and useful. By the end of 1947, the transformation was complete. Former Nazis were no longer universally regarded as enemies. They were selectively rehabilitated as tools in a larger struggle. The line between justice and expediency had been crossed, not with a single decision, but through a series of small, rationalized steps. No grand announcement marked this shift. No vote was taken. It happened in memoranda, meetings, and marginal notes in classified files. And once it happened, it became extraordinarily difficult to undo. The intelligence relationships forged in these early years would persist for decades, shaping operations, alliances, and scandals yet to come. They would also generate a legacy of secrecy that even the end of the Cold War could not fully dismantle. The enemy had changed. The methods, it turned out, had not. By the late 1940s, the United States had crossed a threshold it could no longer acknowledge openly. Former Nazis were no longer merely sources of information gathered in the chaos after Germany's collapse. They had become ongoing intelligence assets, paid, protected, and quietly embedded within American strategic planning. This was the moment when pragmatism hardened into dependency. The files from this period reveal a growing unease inside U.S. intelligence circles. The problem was not simply moral, it was operational. Men, who had survived the fall of the Third Reich and reinvented themselves as anti-communist informants, carried with them a dangerous liability. Their pasts could resurface at any moment. And when they did, the consequences could be catastrophic. Few cases illustrate this tension more clearly than that of Otto von Bolschwing. Bolschwing was not a scientist, an engineer, or a technical specialist. He was something far more volatile. During the war, he had been an SS officer and an intelligence operative, associated with Adolf Eichmann's circle, involved in Jewish deportation policy and anti-Jewish measures in Romania and elsewhere. His career was political, ideological, and operational. There was no neutral way to describe his work. After 1945, Bolshwing did what many like him attempted. He vanished into the bureaucratic fog of post-war Europe. He was arrested by Allied forces, interrogated, and released. By 1948, American intelligence officers were already aware of his background. His file contained references to his SS rank, his ideological commitments, and his proximity to Eichmann's operations. What it also contained was something intelligence agencies valued deeply: access. Bolshwing had contacts among former Nazi intelligence officers, émigré anti-communists, and underground networks forming across Austria and West Germany. He spoke the language of Cold War paranoia fluently. He knew how to frame his past as ideological zeal, redirected against a new enemy. Most importantly, he understood that information had become a currency. In 1949, the CIA made its decision. Despite internal warnings, Bolshwing was recruited as an asset. He provided intelligence on communist organizations, Soviet influence in Europe, and émigré groups considered vulnerable to infiltration. Reports from the period describe him as cooperative, articulate, and strongly anti-Soviet. His Nazi past was acknowledged, but classified as a secondary concern. The calculus was familiar by now. Whatever Bolshwing had done during the war was over. The Soviet threat was immediate. Intelligence officers reassured themselves that they could manage the risk. What they underestimated was time. In 1954, Bolshwing was allowed to immigrate to the United States under a special arrangement that bypassed normal scrutiny. His immigration file, like many others, had been sanitized. References to his SS service were minimized or omitted. He settled in California, built a business career, and became a naturalized U.S. citizen. For several years, the system appeared to work. Then, in May 1960, everything changed. Israeli agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires and smuggled him to Israel to stand trial. The news sent shockwaves through intelligence agencies across the world, but nowhere more acutely than inside the CIA. Eichmann's name was radioactive. Anyone connected to him risked exposure. Inside Langley, officials began reviewing old files in panic. Bolshwing's name resurfaced almost immediately. Internal memoranda from 1960 reveal a sense of alarm bordering on desperation. Officers worried that Eichmann, under interrogation, might mention associates who were now living quietly in the United States. If Bolshwing's relationship with the CIA became public, the scandal would not be limited to one man. It would expose a pattern of post-war cooperation with perpetrators of the Holocaust. The response was not to sever ties or alert prosecutors. It was damage control. CIA officials discussed how to limit exposure, how to classify documents more tightly, and how to prepare responses in case Bolshwing's past emerged publicly. The priority was not justice. It was containment. The agency understood that it was now implicated, not merely as a passive observer, but as an active protector. Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in 1961 intensified the fear. Testimony revealed the bureaucratic machinery of genocide in excruciating detail. Names, roles, and chains of command were dissected publicly. The world watched as survivors described deportations, selections, and mass murder. Bolshwing was never mentioned in court. But the risk remained. For another 2 decades, the system held. Bolshwing lived undisturbed in the United States, his CIA relationship buried in classified files. It was only in the late 1970s, amid renewed investigations into Nazi war criminals living in America, that his past finally surfaced. In 1981, the U.S. Department of Justice moved to revoke Bolshwing's citizenship after uncovering evidence of his SS service and involvement in anti-Jewish policies. Faced with exposure and legal consequences, Bolshwing suffered a series of strokes and died in 1982 before the case could go to trial. The CIA's role in protecting him remained classified for years. Bolshwing was not an anomaly. He was a warning. Another case demonstrated the same logic, with even more disastrous consequences. Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon, had served as a Gestapo officer responsible for torture, deportations, and executions in occupied France. After the war, he was arrested by American counterintelligence, interrogated, and, crucially, recruited as an informant. U.S. officers knew exactly who Barbie was. His file contained explicit references to his crimes. French authorities demanded his extradition. The CIA and its predecessor agencies refused. Barbie, they argued, was too valuable in the emerging struggle against communism. He had contacts, operational experience, and local knowledge. Rather than hand him over, American intelligence helped Barbie escape to South America in the early 1950s. He lived for decades in Bolivia under an alias, advising authoritarian regimes and remaining active in security and repression. When Barbie was finally extradited to France in 1983 and put on trial, the revelations were explosive. Testimony and documents showed that U.S. intelligence had knowingly shielded him from justice. The moral outrage was global. Inside the United States, officials responded with carefully worded statements. Mistakes had been made. Decisions were complex. The Cold War context, they insisted, mattered. What these cases revealed was not just moral failure, but structural weakness. Once intelligence agencies invested in compromised assets, they became hostages to their own secrecy. The exposure of one file threatened to unravel others. The safest option, time and again, was concealment. This dynamic explains why, decades later, so many CIA files related to former Nazis remain partially redacted. It is not only about protecting sources or methods that are still relevant. It is about protecting decisions and the people who made them. The more historians dug into the archives, the clearer the pattern became. Intelligence agencies did not merely overlook past crimes. They actively intervened to prevent their consequences. Investigations were delayed. Leads were deflected. Information was withheld from prosecutors. All of this was justified internally as necessity. The Cold War rewarded results, not reflection. What makes the story particularly unsettling is how ordinary it became. These were not rogue agents acting against policy. They were officials following incentives embedded in the system. Success meant producing intelligence, not moral clarity. Failure meant exposure. By the time the Cold War ended, many of the most damaging files had already outlived their subjects. The men involved were dead or elderly. Accountability arrived too late to matter legally. But the files remained. And when they were finally opened, selectively, reluctantly, they revealed a truth far more uncomfortable than any conspiracy theory. The United States did not merely make isolated compromises. It built a post-war intelligence strategy that accepted collaboration with known perpetrators of mass crime as a cost of doing business. This was the deal with the devil, not signed in blood, but filed in triplicate. The next chapter will show why this deal proved so difficult to unwind, and why, even after laws mandated disclosure, parts of the story remain stubbornly, deliberately incomplete. By the time the Cold War reached its height in the 1950s, secrecy had ceased to be a temporary measure. It had become an operating principle. What began as an improvised response to post-war chaos hardened into doctrine, and intelligence files, especially those involving former Nazis, were sealed not simply to protect operations, but to protect decisions already made. Inside the CIA, the danger was no longer hypothetical. Officials understood that if the full scope of post-war cooperation with Nazi perpetrators became public, the damage would not be limited to individual reputations. It would call into question the moral foundation of American intelligence itself. The agency's legitimacy depended on the idea that its compromises were limited, justified, and safely confined to the past. The files threatened to prove otherwise. From the late 1940s onward, intelligence memoranda reveal a recurring fear: exposure. Not exposure of sources in the field, but exposure of relationships. Relationships that could not be defended without admitting that war criminals had been protected, paid, and sometimes relocated with American assistance. Relationships that contradicted the public narrative of post-war justice. This fear shaped how records were classified from the beginning. Files involving former Nazis were often marked with higher security levels than comparable intelligence reports. Access was restricted to narrow circles. Cross-referencing was discouraged. In some cases, entire categories of documents were separated physically from standard archives, stored under different indexing systems to make tracing connections more difficult. The purpose was not to erase history, but to fragment it. A single file might seem innocuous, a name redacted here, a paragraph removed there. But when assembled, these omissions formed a pattern of deliberate opacity. Intelligence officers learned to write in a way that revealed just enough to justify action, while concealing enough to deny responsibility later. Language was the first line of defense. Former SS officers became anti-communist émigrés. Known collaborators were described as local security contacts. Incriminating details were replaced with euphemisms such as wartime activities or political associations. The effect was cumulative. Files could be released decades later and still fail to tell the full story. By the 1960s, this approach had become self-sustaining. Each unreleased document justified the continued classification of others. Revealing one compromised asset risked exposing the mechanisms that protected him, and by extension, others still hidden. Secrecy fed on itself. The capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960 was a moment of profound anxiety for American intelligence. It demonstrated that time did not guarantee silence. Old crimes could resurface unexpectedly, driven not by governments, but by individuals and moral urgency. Eichmann's trial forced intelligence agencies to confront the possibility that their post-war bargains might be dragged into public view. Internally, this did not produce a rush toward transparency. It produced caution. Files were reviewed, reclassified, and in some cases, further restricted. Officials worried less about Eichmann's testimony than about what it might inspire. Renewed scrutiny, demands for extradition, questions about who had been protected and why. The safest course was to ensure that existing records remained inaccessible. This pattern repeated itself throughout the Cold War. Whenever the political climate shifted toward openness, intelligence agencies responded defensively. When public trust eroded during the Vietnam era and journalists began probing government secrecy, files involving Nazi collaborators were among the most carefully guarded. They represented a vulnerability that could not be explained away as a product of wartime confusion. Even the creation of oversight mechanisms failed to penetrate this barrier fully. Congressional committees tasked with reviewing intelligence practices often encountered resistance when they approached the subject of former Nazis. Briefings were selective. Documents arrived late or heavily redacted. The justification was always national security, but national security was no longer the real issue. By the 1970s, many of the individuals involved were no longer operationally relevant. Some were dead. Others were retired. The intelligence they had once provided was obsolete. What remained sensitive were the choices made by American officials, the precedents set, the lines crossed, the protections extended. The problem was institutional memory. To release the files fully would have meant acknowledging that collaboration with known perpetrators of mass violence was not an aberration, but a recurring strategy. It would have required admitting that the United States had sometimes obstructed justice deliberately, not accidentally. That admission would have raised uncomfortable questions about later intelligence practices, built on similar logic. When Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act in 1998, it appeared to signal a turning point. The law mandated the review and release of records related to Nazi war crimes and post-war interactions with U.S. agencies. Millions of pages were eventually processed. Historians gained access to material that had been sealed for half a century. Yet even then, the pattern persisted. Many documents were released only after years of delay. Others appeared with extensive redactions. Some files referenced attachments that were never included. The law forced disclosure, but it did not eliminate discretion. Intelligence agencies retained the authority to withhold information they deemed sensitive. Officially, the reasons were technical: protection of sources and methods, privacy concerns, foreign relations. In practice, these categories often overlapped with reputational risk. Revealing the name of a source could reveal the nature of a relationship. Revealing the nature of a relationship could reveal a crime that had been ignored or concealed. The result was partial truth. Historians working through the archives encountered the same frustration repeatedly. The outline of events was visible, but the connective tissue was missing. Decisions appeared without decision-makers. Outcomes appeared without explanations. Responsibility dissolved into anonymity. This was not accidental. It was the final stage of containment. By controlling what could be known, intelligence agencies controlled how history would be written. They ensured that post-war collaboration with Nazis would appear as a series of isolated incidents, rather than a systemic pattern. Each case could be explained away as a mistake, a product of its time, an exception. The broader structure remained obscured. What makes the continued redaction of these files so striking is not the information they likely contain, but what their concealment reveals. It shows that even decades later, American institutions remain uncomfortable confronting the full implications of their Cold War choices. The fear is no longer Soviet retaliation. It is moral reckoning. To release the files completely would force a reassessment of how intelligence power is exercised in moments of perceived existential threat. It would challenge the idea that democratic ends automatically justify undemocratic means. It would complicate the narrative of post-war American leadership. And so the files remain incomplete, not because the truth would endanger the present, but because it would reinterpret the past. This is why the story does not end with legislation or declassification. It lingers in archives where pages are still missing and names still hidden. The Cold War may be over, but its logic survives in the way institutions protect themselves from judgment. The final chapter will confront what this unfinished history means, why selective memory persists, and what it tells us about power, fear, and the limits of accountability when victory becomes the highest value. History rarely breaks through walls of secrecy all at once. It seeps, it leaks. It arrives in fragments that only make sense when placed side by side, years or decades after the decisions they describe. That was how the truth about America's post-war deals with former Nazis began to emerge. By the late 1960s, the moral confidence that had defined the early Cold War was eroding. The Vietnam War shattered public trust in official narratives. The Pentagon Papers proved that secrecy had been used not just to protect the nation, but to mislead it. For the first time since World War II, journalists, historians, and lawmakers felt emboldened to ask whether the government's past actions matched its professed values. The first questions about Nazi collaborators living quietly in the United States did not come from intelligence insiders. They came from survivors, European prosecutors, and investigative reporters who noticed something strange. Men accused of crimes against humanity had vanished from post-war Europe without a trace, only to reappear decades later as American residents, sometimes even citizens. Initial government responses were dismissive. Officials claimed ignorance, suggested bureaucratic errors, or insisted that all relevant cases had already been handled by the Nuremberg trials. But the records told a different story. Slowly, inconsistencies surfaced. Immigration files contradicted European court documents. Biographies looked too clean. Dates did not line up. What made these discoveries explosive was not that the United States had failed to prosecute every Nazi criminal. That was already understood. It was the growing evidence that American intelligence agencies had sometimes intervened deliberately to prevent prosecution. In the 1970s, this suspicion hardened into fact. Congressional inquiries, spurred by broader investigations into intelligence abuses, began uncovering internal memoranda that hinted at systematic protection. Files showed that requests from foreign governments for extradition had been delayed or ignored. Investigations had been redirected. In some cases, agencies had actively helped individuals evade capture, citing their value as informants or operatives. The response from intelligence officials was defensive, but consistent. These decisions, they argued, had been made under extraordinary circumstances. The Cold War was not an abstract competition. It was a perceived fight for survival. Choices that looked indefensible in hindsight, they insisted, had seemed necessary at the time. That explanation satisfied few. In 1979, the U.S. Department of Justice created the Office of Special Investigations, tasked specifically with identifying and prosecuting Nazi war criminals living in the United States. Its mandate was narrow but ambitious: strip citizenship from those who had obtained it through deception and pursue their deportation. What investigators found confirmed the worst fears. Case after case revealed that American agencies had possessed incriminating information decades earlier and chosen not to act. Files contained references to SS service, involvement in deportations, and participation in repression, information that had been deemed inconvenient rather than disqualifying. In some instances, intelligence agencies had explicitly warned prosecutors away from certain individuals. The Office of Special Investigations faced a dilemma of its own. Pursuing these cases aggressively risked exposing not only criminals, but the institutions that had protected them. Every courtroom battle threatened to become a referendum on Cold War intelligence practices. As a result, justice moved cautiously. Some cases ended quietly. Individuals agreed to leave the United States voluntarily in exchange for avoiding trial. Others died before proceedings could begin. A few were successfully denaturalized. But even then, the broader context, the role of American intelligence, was often left unexplored. The public learned pieces of the story, but never the whole. The most significant breakthrough came not from prosecutors, but from legislation. In 1998, Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, responding to years of pressure from historians and human rights advocates. The law required U.S. government agencies to identify, review, and release records related to Nazi war crimes and post-war interactions with suspected perpetrators. It was, on paper, a radical act of transparency. Over the next several years, millions of pages were examined. Vast collections of documents were transferred to the National Archives. Researchers gained access to material that had been sealed since the Truman administration. And yet, even as the archives opened, the limits of disclosure became apparent. Many documents arrived heavily redacted. Names were removed. Key paragraphs were blacked out. Some files referenced attachments that were missing entirely. Others appeared only after repeated requests and years of delay. The law had forced agencies to open their vaults, but it had not forced them to tell the full story. Historians began to notice a pattern. The most heavily censored files were not those describing battlefield operations or technical intelligence methods. They were the ones that documented relationships, who had been recruited, who had approved the recruitment, and who had intervened when accountability loomed. What remained hidden was not the existence of collaboration, but its depth. This selective transparency created a strange, Historical landscape. The outline of America's post-war bargain with former Nazis was visible, but its inner logic was obscured. Decisions appeared without decision-makers. Protections existed without clear justification. Responsibility dissolved into anonymity. For intelligence agencies, this ambiguity was a feature, not a flaw. Full disclosure would have required admitting that the Cold War's moral compromises were not isolated lapses, but recurring strategies. It would have forced a reckoning with the idea that democratic institutions had sometimes chosen secrecy over justice, not by accident, but by design. As the Cold War faded into history, the urgency to confront these questions diminished. The Soviet Union collapsed. The existential threat that had justified extraordinary measures vanished. What remained was embarrassment and the fear of precedent. If the files were released fully, what would they teach future generations about the limits of accountability? What would they suggest about later intelligence practices justified by new threats? Terrorism, for example, or emerging global rivals. The past, it turned out, was still dangerous. And so the truth emerged unevenly, filtered through redactions and euphemisms. Enough to confirm wrongdoing, not enough to assign responsibility clearly. The story remained unfinished, not because the evidence was lacking, but because institutions had learned how to survive exposure. The Nazi files the CIA still will not fully release are not dangerous, because of what they might reveal about long-dead men. They are dangerous because of what they reveal about power. They show how easily moral certainty can erode when fear takes hold, how quickly enemies can become tools, how readily justice can be postponed until it no longer matters. The Cold War did not invent these tendencies. It normalized them. America's deal with the devil was not a single agreement signed in secret. It was a series of choices made quietly, justified pragmatically, and defended bureaucratically. Each choice seemed manageable on its own. Together, they reshaped the boundaries of accountability. The files remained partially closed, not because the truth would destabilize the present, but because it would clarify the past. It would force acknowledgement that victory came at a cost, measured not only in money and lives, but in principles compromised and justice deferred. The Cold War ended without a final reckoning. Its archives are still speaking, slowly, reluctantly, and incompletely. What they ask is not whether the United States acted out of fear. That much is obvious. They ask whether fear should ever be allowed to decide who deserves justice, and who is allowed to disappear into the margins of history. The files are there. The black bars remain. And until they are removed, the verdict stays unresolved.